All right, this is, I'm Cindy Haws. I should give you a little bit of my background. For many years, I've worked in natural resources. My focus has been wildlife ecology, and I worked for the Forest Service in a number of different positions until I eventually achieved a wildlife position and worked there for many years. And I worked on the Umpqua National Forest for quite a few years in my Forest Service career. I also worked in Idaho doing grizzly bear work and other types of things at two different forests in Idaho. And then after I left the Forest Service, I began teaching, and I have my master's in education, and I taught both middle school and high school. And then I've also taught at UCC, and then currently I just teach a couple classes there, basically semi-retired, but also president of Umpqua Natural Leadership Science Hub. And it was clear to me that we really needed to have more environmental science in the Umpqua watershed. And so that's something that I've dedicated myself to helping with. And so Umpqua Natural Leadership Science Hub we've been around since 2016. You see our information there as far as our Gmail and website and Facebook. So today I'm going to talk about Unleash. Unleash is participation in wetland revitalization. And I'm incorporating very important science principles as well as trying to identify for you some education opportunities. The reason that I'm incorporating science principles, I have to let you know, is because as I've been teaching at wildlife and fisheries, principles of wildlife and fisheries conservation at UCC now for, gosh, I think it's been 10 years or so. Every single student in the group that's taking my class keeps telling me, you need to integrate, you need to find a way to integrate these principles all the way down to elementary school. And so I'm so happy that you're here today so that I can share some of those with you. And eventually maybe we have more of a relationship as to the meaning of these principles and their importance and how to apply them, how to give examples to even children as young as 7 years old. So I'm incorporating that also in the application of wetlands and wetland revitalization. And as you may know, wetlands are vital to life in so many ways. And I found ways that I didn't even realize over time. And teaching these principles, incorporating the wetland concept is really valuable, and it's important and vital to life. So most of our wetlands are in bad shape. You know, you walk up to a wetland or you walk up to what you might consider to be a lake or a pond, and you may think, oh, well, you know, there's water, there's plants, everything seems fine. But in reality, over the last 30-something years, as I've examined that as a wildlife biologist, I've learned that they are not in good shape, and there's been very significant impacts to them all over the Umpqua Basin, all over the state and beyond. And from those impacts are from a physical, a chemical, and a biological standpoint. And so understanding, beginning to see that is really a first step, because as you walk, as I say, as you walk up to a wetland, it may seem perfectly fine until you actually start looking at what's going on in the wetland. And so this presentation encompasses the physical, chemical, and biological sciences, because all of those are very important for wetlands. And so this is really a great opportunity when you think of science and teaching science, because it integrates all three of those. And so it's a meaningful and experiential learning experience for students as well. So in terms of principles, start thinking this way. Start thinking in terms of systematic versus symptomatic thinking and what the difference of those two things are. And actually start helping young people learn the difference between systematic thinking and symptomatic thinking, because that's a very, I guess I almost want to call it a human frailty, that we tend to think in a symptomatic way because it's linear and it's a way that we think we solve a problem, but in reality, we're simply treating a symptom. And you could probably start thinking of examples of that for many things. And as you're sitting there, try to think of some examples so that maybe we could discuss those later. In a systematic way, you're taking a look at the entire system and you're looking at how that system has a composition, how that system has a structure, and how that system has a function. And when you think of structure, you have to put an S next to that, structures and processes and functions. And the composition can't be just one thing. It's many, many, many different elements in that system that are present or absent that facilitate the structure and the functioning of the system. And natural systems are very much, that's how we need to look at them in order to understand what's going on. So when you consider any kind of proposed action to address a problem, climate change, think about whether or not that proposed action is really solving the cause of the problem, or it's simply a symptomatic thinking action. So, for example, can you put out fires? Is putting out fires going to address climate change, as an example? Is that a symptomatic or a systematic thinking? So I'm talking about wetlands. And so the first thing I want to do is to introduce you to some of our native species that are associated with these wetlands. And I'll get into the problems that they're having in association with human activities. This is the northern red-legged frog, and Rana aurora is its scientific name. And this is one of the species that we're really focusing on for this wetland rehabilitation. And by the way, because I use the word rehabilitation instead of restoration, is because I've been trained by Chris Mazer, who's one of the most amazing scientists that understands this concepts of these principles and applies them. And I'll refer to him later. But my point here is that it's just an important way to look at systems, because we cannot restore a system. We can't restore everything. After we've already affected a system, we cannot restore it to exactly where it was once. And that's simply because of the fact that there's a basic scientific principle that change happens over time. And you can't really put something back exactly how it was. However, you can revitalize it. You can put back some of the composition or all of the composition if you can. And then the structure can be there, and then the functions can be there. And so they may not be exactly in the same place, but you can revitalize. So the northern red-legged frog is typically associated with shallow water ponds and wetlands with emergent vegetation. And for breeding, they require forested sites with exposed, sunny, still water habitat. And the breeding habitat may be seasonal or permanent. In fact, they evolved to deal with these drought cycles, not like the one we have now that's associated with climate change, but like we've had over time, in which sometimes even a pond that maybe would be there some years year-round might dry up during a drought cycle. And so it's important to understand the evolutionary development of a species and their strategy, because that tells you a lot about how to conserve that species on the land, because they have a strategy that's based on their evolutionary response to various conditions. It tells you a lot about what the land is like itself too. Why do we even have amphibians in the forest? If our forests were really super dry, like some people like to think they once were, like ponderosa pine forests, then we wouldn't have salamanders in the forest that we have, for example. So understanding our evolutionary responses of our animals and plants to what is, to the land around us tells us a lot about what they need and what those processes are in the system that are important to maintain. So one of the things that just came up recently about these species of red-legged frogs and other frogs like them is that they can be stressed as tadpoles even, and that affects their movement on land, putting their survival at risk. And that's a recent one. But as you can imagine, the northern red-legged frog has had some impacts associated with climate change, and actually much of it is impact associated with other human activities before that, including logging and roading and changing the habitat of the wetlands, which I'll get into later here. So the findings indicate that changing patterns of precipitation and drought for the red-legged in terms of climate change now, and these other stress factors that I'll get into, are going to have an impact on these species. And I've already seen that, and I've been monitoring that for years. Here is a red-legged egg mass. I'm showing you that because I'd love to have you come out and help me survey and monitor these wetlands. And so I want to get you familiar with what this looks like, because this is a main focus of this focus species that we use, because the northern red-legged frog is very sensitive to these modifications that are happening in the wetlands. And so it's a good species to track their population condition, and using egg masses is an easy way to track their population condition, because one female lays one mass of eggs every year, and that reflects therefore on the number of females that are in that wetland population. And keep in mind, the red-legged frog is not just a species that uses the wetland, that's its breeding habitat and its rearing habitat for its tadpoles, but it also uses the adjacent forest for moist forest habitat. And we have not that much information about that phase in its life. We know that they're out there, but we don't know much about it other than if you have really good moist forest conditions, which that means older forest, mature forest with high canopy, with lots of big down wood in the forest floor and shrubs in the forest floor, unlike logging and plantations, that completely eliminates that habitat. So you can see that this species, while it's not necessarily directly an old growth associate, requires that habitat anyway, and it's important for them in order to maintain substantial populations. That's one thing we're finding, according to Dr. Mark Hayes, who's a herpetologist, is that this species, if it has really good old moist forest, or mature, I like to say mature because it's not just old forest, it's mature and old, or lots of down wood and canopy cover, they're going to do better. And their populations are going to be much more stable and more reflective of what it should be for them, the norm for them. So here's another species that we survey for too. And these species that I'm selecting right now are the main species that the UNLSH is conducting surveys for. We're currently working at one private land wetland site, Susan Applegate's place. And we're also working on the Tiller Ranger District with several of their wetland areas that are impacted by human activities. And I'll get into that more later. We're focusing on the elevation range where the red-legged frog is, simply because we had those areas are impacted, and we know that there's a significant impact to the population. So we're starting there first because we need to address those issues and try to restore the populations there. This species here is the northwestern salamander. It also can be found in those wetlands, and understanding the difference between egg masses, between the red-legged egg mass that you just saw in the prior slide, and this egg mass is key to doing the surveys. And so you can see here, this egg mass it's smaller. You can kind of put it in the palm of your hand, but the key difference is that it's actually quite rubbery. And so if you touched it, it feels like it adheres very well to itself. And so versus the red-legged frog egg mass, it's more of like a cantaloupe size. And when you touch it, it's more, you can kind of like, it's more gushy. It doesn't stick together as well as this does. The best way to describe this is rubbery. And the northwestern salamander is like the red-legged in that it has a wetland phase for breeding and reproduction and rearing, and it also has a terrestrial phase. And I've actually seen adult northwestern salamanders at least 1.5 miles away from a breeding pond, and they depend, like the red-legged, they depend a lot on this down wood, because the down wood in a forest keeps them moist. It maintains moisture both on the surface level of the forest floor as well as below the surface level of the forest floor. And a lot of these species will utilize small mammal and larger mammal burrows, because that'll maintain moisture. But the dead wood is real key for that too, because if you have the dead wood on top of those burrows, that helps keep that microclimate condition you need to maintain moisture for the species. And they do indeed, as all amphibians, most amphibians breathe through their skin, and so they have to have that moist condition. So here's some other pond breeding amphibians that might be in the areas where we survey. And I'm mainly referring to a lower elevation, because the northern red-legged frog tends to occur at sea level and up to about 3,500 feet. And then there's another species of frog that's similar genus, it's Rana, but it's a cascade, it's a cascades frog, and it then starts up, it's got a different niche. The niche is in the higher elevation, so it starts, there's some overlap between the two, and I'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, these are species that you could find in the sea level, the same area where the northern red-legged frog is. And so we look for these. However, we're not doing as much data collection on them as we are the northern, because the northern kind of gives us an indicator of the success conditions in those wetlands in terms of the factors that are influencing the species that are breeding in there and rearing their young in there. So we've got the Pacific chorus frog here in the upper right. We've got the rough-skinned newt in the lower right. And one of the things that's of interest to the rough-skinned newt is that the males will tend to stay in the water, stay in the wetlands after breeding, and stay there all summer long. Whereas the females will go into the forest, and you'll find them in dead wood again. That dead wood's real important. And that's where they'll eat. There's lots of centipedes and other insects there that they eat that help control and manage the insect population. In fact, here's an interesting side note that I just thought of. They're finding that salamanders in the forest actually eat the insects that shred the humus of the forest, and that's a good thing, because then that humus doesn't get shredded and digested. Instead, it's actually leaf litter at that point, not humus. Instead, it actually gets buried into the soil and becomes humus, and then is captured as carbon. So in looking at that, they can actually quantify that the salamanders in the forest actually help capture and store carbon, which is important for this issue with climate change. So interesting side note. But anyway, another species here, the lower left, is the long-toed salamander, and it's another species that could likely be in the areas that we survey. However, we haven't found them in the ones that we've been trying to do restoration work on. I think that's just mainly because they're just not in that, doesn't fit their criteria totally. But those are species that you could encounter. This is the cascades frog. As I mentioned, this one inhabits higher elevations, somewhere above 2,400 feet and above. It tends to also be associated with wet mountain meadows, bogs, and potholes. I've seen them lay their egg masses in potholes and wondered if they would make it, but never was able to monitor the results of that. So they're kind of similar in their breeding habits to the northern red-legged, but a little bit different in how and what they inhabit. They too are probably in very difficult position and not reproducing well, according to some of the other monitoring that's going on. But I personally haven't had an opportunity to monitor them so much, because I've been so focused on these other impacted wetlands that need attention. So, but someday perhaps we'll get to address those as well. And here's another species, the western toad, that used to be all over, including the low elevation Umpqua Valley, and isn't. So we've lost this species in the lower elevations, though it still occurs in the upper elevations in some of the high mountain lakes mainly, and in the North Umpqua and some of the higher elevation wetlands up there. This is a species we've totally lost in the Umpqua, and it's actually now restricted to very, very few places. It's the Oregon spotted frog. It is really, really aquatic. It doesn't have that terrestrial life phase that the others have. And that's probably why we've lost it, is because we've lost a lot of the permanent aquatic wetlands, and those that occur on private lands have been so modified that they can't function as such for habitat for the species, combined with the fact that we've had, and I'll get into here soon, a lot of impacts by introduction of non-native invasive fish and the bullfrog. So here now is a start to talk about, this is another group of species that we also need to pay attention to in regards to both wetlands and creeks, which brings an opportunity that I'm not really going to focus on today, because streams also have issues. And this particular issue is especially apparent in the Umpqua Basin. There are a number of non-native invasive crayfish that are taking over. I've put the upper left species is our native species, the signal crayfish. And these species do occur in wetlands as well as streams. That lower right one is the one that I've seen the most in our streams that is invasive, the ringed crayfish. We've done some youth camps here in Myrtle Creek with kids from the age of 8 to 12, 13 years old. And we've seen a lot of this invasive ringed crayfish in Myrtle Creek proper, which is of concern because they're having impacts on our native crayfish as well as other species in our streams. And that affects the health of the stream and the water quality of the stream as well. So here are some stream amphibians. I'm bringing these up because there certainly is educational opportunities with students and in our lowland streams that are more accessible than perhaps going up to the forest where the wetlands are, that are in a place where you can actually see things. But I really would like us to do that, to take students to these wetlands as well. But anyway, these species are in trouble as well. You've got the tailed frog in the upper left there. That species is in big trouble because of logging and roads and the sedimentation and the alteration of the stream structure. Is wiping them out. Their tadpoles have suction-like mouth parts that actually eat algae off the rocks. And so they're a very valuable water quality contributor and other things, and they're in trouble. And then on the upper right side is the southern torrent salamander. It's a headwater stream species. And if you know anything about the laws in regard to logging, there is very little protection of headwater streams. In fact, on private land, there's no protection currently, though there's some discussion of some protection, but there's been so much impact from all of the logging that's occurred up to date. This species is in big trouble, and we're losing it because we're impacting those headwater streams. We're changing the structure. We're causing what is called head cutting, which I can't really get into too much today, but I will a little bit. We're causing head cutting that is actually just unraveling their habitat. And then on the bottom there is the foothills yellow-legged frog. And that species is also being impacted by stream morphology changes and by non-native invasive species like bass. You know, bass are impacting our salmon as well in streams, and bass are impacting this species heavily, as well as the bullfrog, and as well as all the changes in the stream habitat conditions, including increased temperature and reduction of summer flows and too high of winter flows. So there are terrestrial species that are impacted too, forest terrestrial species, but those are not easy for educational purposes, other than learning about the forest and the evolutionary relationships, which can be pretty cool. So it's just it's harder to go out there into the forest and show a student here's a forest salamander. It's hard to find them, and you almost have to destroy their habitat to find them. So it's not something you could readily do. It's something you could maybe bring some examples to class and then go out to the forest and describe and look at the habitat, which can be fun and can be done in conjunction with doing some wetland stuff. And so one of the issues to all of this is logging and conversions of forests to plantations, roads, recreation, climate change. All those things are impacting the wetlands, and they're impacting their terrestrial habitats as well. Because keep in mind, even these wetland species, a lot of them have terrestrial phases. So this brings up some principles to be covered. And one of the key principles, these are called they're actually inviolable biophysical principles. And they're like a foundation. They're foundational principles to keep in mind that help even young people start to think about things in a better way. And that is, everything is a relationship. Everything is in relationship to everything else. There's no independent variable. Even in science, we try to separate out variables, we have controls, and then we act upon something and introduce a variable to try to evaluate how that might affect something. But the reality is there's always a lot of variables happening. That said, the key point here is that understanding and respecting that everything is in relationship with everything else can still give you a good compass as to what you need to do to help maintain and revitalize these systems that are not functioning properly and are causing major losses in species and habitats. So nothing is inert, such as chemicals. That's something we have to keep in mind. You know, they like to say that there are inert things in the chemicals that are being used, but the reality is once you get it out into the environment, there's all kinds of things that go on and all kinds of interactions that go on with those chemicals that were never tested and never understood. And if you know anything about the PFAS and PFOA stuff going on right now, which you may or may not, that's a really good example of some really upcoming problems that are affecting a lot of our water. So all freedom is relative and all systems are open. There's no such thing as a closed system in nature. Another principle is that all relationships are self-reinforcing feedback loops. By the way, I'm not covering all the principles that are associated with this learning. I'm just covering some focused ones because it would take too long. But these are ones that really do kind of apply to these wetland conditions that we're monitoring and surveying and trying to rehabilitate. And so all relationships are self-reinforcing feedback loops where they are deemed positive or negative. And when you deal with these wetlands currently, we're dealing with things like introduction of a non-native fish. That has a real self-reinforcing feedback loop in terms of how that alters the entire wetland system, because you've got these non-native bass, for example, that are in the water, and they're completely changing the zooplankton, the phytoplankton, the insect population. You know, the species that are present are getting changed. And you can do macroinvertebrate surveys in places where these fish occur versus places where these fish do not occur, and you can see differences. And so there are these self-reinforcing feedback loops when you introduce these, for example, the bass, and we also have sunfish like crappie and bluegill and pumpkin seed fish that are getting introduced. And we have bullheads that are getting introduced. These are all warm water species, not native to here. And they're affecting our wetlands in those ways and changing how those wetlands once functioned. Our wetlands were not areas that had a lot of algae in it, for example. And now we're having major issues with eutrophication and algae. And I'll get into that more later. So all relationships have one or more trade-offs. All relationships are irreversible. And all systems are based on composition, structure, and function. And that's a focus for today, is composition, structure, and function. And that's something that students can really relate to and wrap their mind around when you start looking at that. If you're talking about plants, you're talking about different species. When you're talking composition, composition is the different species that are present. Perhaps some of it is different physical conditions are present in an ecosystem. When you think of an ecosystem, it's the living and the non-living parts of that system. And so, you know, your composition encompasses both of those, and both of those also contribute to the structure present in that system. So even, you know, a species present is a structure. You could use a whale as an example. A whale in the ocean is not just a whale in the ocean, it is a structure in the ocean. And that structure has a very significant function. And you may not realize this, but once we reduced the whale populations through whaling, that had a huge feedback loop effect on the entire ocean ecosystem and caused different species to utilize the system completely differently. And that changed populations of many, many things, like the killer whale that used to eat bigger whales no longer could eat bigger whales. So they switched their prey base to some of their other prey and heavily preyed upon them, like the sea otter, for example, that then majorly altered the sea kelp. You know, so everything is connected, everything has a relationship. So a systemic whole of any kind has 5 basic components. It has composition, structure, function, and there's system altering disturbances. There's always been that, you know, that you have volcanoes that erupt, you have fires that happen, but that has a natural evolutionary response to it. It's when you add this human caused influence on top of that, you actually can cause total threshold changes in ecosystems. And that's what we're probably going to be seeing with climate change. And then the negotiability of constraints, how constraints can reduce the changes over these influences. Say, for example, when Mount St. Helens went off, there was all of those trees that were flattened, but not all those, a lot of those trees that were flattened, they didn't just go up in smoke, they didn't turn to total ash, they were present on the ground, and there were small mammals that came in and could change all of that and introduce and facilitate the seeding of that area to redevelop the forest again. In other words, humans didn't need to go out and plant that. It would have come up on its own and did in places. So the principles here also need to consider the basic habitat components, such as food, water, shelter, space, which is usually taken for granted. We all get the food, water, shelter part, but space is usually taken for granted when we discuss habitat. And especially because people and kids too tend to think just about one individual, you know, oh, you know, that bear needs space, but really that population of bears needs space. And when you think of what you need for a population, for a stable population, that becomes much larger in terms of how much space is necessary. And the same goes for wetlands. You need to have the space within the wetlands for the habitat within the wetlands to be able to have the attachment. For the northern red-legged frog, they attach their egg masses to emergent vegetation. If you don't have a big enough area with a big enough amount of emergent vegetation there, you're not going to have that population. And so that's important. And then privacy is often overlooked as a component of habitat, but species need to have non-disturbed conditions in order to be able to effectively reproduce. And then connectivity is also something that we have to really focus on, especially today with all of the fragmented habitats that have been created. And so that makes, you know, that makes an important component for everything we do. And important to take into account when we're restoring a wetland. Like right now, the Applegate wetland is one that we're looking at, and we're looking at how that is, where it is and adjacent to the forest nearby, and where it is in relation to the creek nearby, and what kind of corridor is available or needs to be beefed up so that the species that move to the wetland can freely and not fearfully move from the wetland back to these areas. So for example, western pond turtle is a species that we're focusing on for that particular place. And we want to make sure that the pond turtles, they will use the wetland, but they will also move to use the creek. And so you want to make sure that they have free movement to that area. And you also want to make sure that they can get to their nesting habitat. We've actually put in some extra nesting habitat there for them near the wetlands so that they don't have to travel as far. But it's going to take time to see them actually use that because of their strategy of going back to the same place year after year. We'll have to get, and we have to know that. We have to know that the females have an evolutionary strategy where they go to the same nesting area and nest every year. And knowing that, then obviously we're not going to change their pattern. If they're 30 years old and they go to that spot, that's where they're going to go. But as they continue to reproduce young, those young may go off and find these new nesting areas that are not so far away from their wetland habitat and utilize them. So that's the kind of stuff you got to look at, which gets to the fact that there's always time lags involving these things. And we have to keep in mind, just like with climate change, there's a lag time. With these scenarios, there's always some kind of lag time. So you can't go out and say after you've treated an area a year after and think that you can monitor or survey that area and get the answers to whether or not what was done was either an impact or a benefit to a species. It's something you have to do for a number of years afterwards, and you have to understand the evolutionary strategy of the species you're monitoring in order to know how long you may have to do that and the biology of the species. And sometimes we don't know that much, but we do our best. So all systems are defined by their function. So it's not an isolated species. And so extinctions of species matter because everything functions. There's this, often there's a misunderstanding sometimes about ecology and the thoughts that, oh, well, there's one decomposer and then there's another decomposer. And so that decomposer, if it goes extinct, no problem, we got another decomposer. But the reality is every species has its own unique niche. And every time you lose a species, you lose a function. There's a interesting issue going on right now with sea stars, and 2 species are being heavily impacted on the Oregon coast by climate change conditions. One species appears like it may go extinct, and sea stars, like the otter, for example, are a species that helps keep the kelp forest intact. So you keep losing. So we've reduced our otter. We don't really have an otter population in the state of Oregon. Now we're going to lose one of the sea star species. Now you start seeing a threshold difference in that ecosystem because the functions are that all 3 of those species they prey upon sea urchins, and the sea urchin population is exploding, and the sea urchins eat the kelp. And so you get to the point where you just don't have any kelp anymore because you have too many sea urchins. So you get my point here. So all systems have cumulative effects, they have lag periods, and they have thresholds, and all systems are open. And this is another good resource to go to in terms of wetlands. The EPA has guiding principles on how to restore wetlands. And I'm just sharing this with you because it's such a great example of the things you think about when you're trying to restore wetlands. So, so what are the physical impacts that are going on in our wetlands? Well, the existing wetlands are continuing to be lost unintentionally and intentionally. And one of the things that is very concerning to me, and I'm bringing it to your attention because it is something that people don't know about, even generally speaking, the agencies don't even see this because they just aren't inventorying and monitoring wetlands as much as they are other things. But I have been doing this for a number of years and I've been seeing this. And what's happening is that you get this head cutting and you have logging road impacts, and then you have the timber, the logging of the timber, and then you have lower level agriculture like irrigation. And then on top of that, you have the lack of beaver. It's kind of like having the lack of otter in the kelp ecosystem. All of that is a cumulative effect that actually causes our wetlands to drain and dry up and not function properly. And I expect you probably don't know what head cutting is, so I'm going to focus on that one because that's something that we're specifically addressing in several of our wetlands on the Tiller Ranger District, where UNLSH is conducting monitoring surveys to evaluate treating these conditions to prevent the wetlands from being lost. And so what head cutting is, it's when a stream is experiencing an impact either by logging or by a road below that causes the stream to literally unravel, unzip. It starts from the bottom and it works where that logging or where that road is, and you see down cutting. And you've probably, if you go out into the forest anywhere on BLM land in particular and look at your streams, you're going to see lots and lots of raw soil and what is called down cutting, where you see bedrock, a lot of bedrock instead of gravel and sediment buildup. You see a lot of bedrock. And that's the unraveling, and it literally works its way up to these wetlands, and then it down cuts into the wetland, and that's how the wetland is lost. It's drained out. And so this is scary because, first of all, remember, wetlands are our water storage, and it's not just the wetland proper, but a lot of the terrestrial area around that wetland. You start quantifying that as a big old water tank of water storage for our summer flows. And if you depend on, and we all depend on summer flows from the streams for our water and for our food, if you raise any food, this is a big issue. Plus, the wetlands themselves are losing the species capability that they once had. And so this is one of the major physical impacts that are going on. You can imagine how with students you can measure these physical impacts. You can measure that down cutting, and you can measure some of the other conditions with the students and teach them about what a stream should look like and how much sediment should be in there and how much down wood should be in there that makes that stream healthy and helps support the wetlands above. And then what's happened, another physical impact is within the wetlands directly. The wetlands have actually been modified. This was something that was done in the 1980s. It was kind of an unintended consequence situation where people thought that if this was happening on private land and on agency land, people thought if they made wetlands deeper, it would be better. And that's what they did. They did a dredging and they made these deep wetlands deeper. And what that did is it actually created more open water conditions, and it reduced the ecosystem complexity of the wetland with loss of the shelving that normally would be in a wetland that has the emergent vegetation and the riparian habitat. And it kind of like dewatered everything, just concentrated the water into a bowl. And in doing so, it eliminated the function of the emergent and riparian habitat, and you lost that composition in these wetlands, or you reduced it down to such a narrow amount that it can't function properly. And that emergent and riparian vegetation is really important for keeping the water clean. And it's the same on a stream. So it's the same principle applied on a stream. When you have those emergent and riparian habitat conditions in your streams, you have a properly functioning stream. You lose that, you lose the function of the cleaning of the water that those vegetation components do. And from a red-legged frog standpoint and a northwestern salamander standpoint and a cascade frog standpoint, you're losing egg deposition habitat. The red-legged frog actually attaches its eggs to emergent vegetation, and so does the northwestern salamander. Now, the cascade frog doesn't, but it lays its egg in that stuff. It lays its egg mass in that so that it holds it, helps to hold it in place. And so by loss of that, then the species population is going to be impacted, obviously, and the water quality of the system is going to be impacted. And that means that you don't have as much of the species present that are going to clean the water. So if you have a logging unit up above And that logging unit removes the vegetation, which means then the nutrients that are in the soil don't have a place to be uptake, then those nutrients, this has long been known, wash into the stream and then wash into the wetland. And then guess what you get? You get a enriched or a eutrophication process into the wetland, and then you start getting algae, and you start getting problems with the algae on top of other things that I'm going to talk about later when we talk about biological impacts. So a lot of people don't see these physical impacts when you walk up to a pond or a wetland. It just looks like a pond. And then many wetlands have been developed into recreation sites that are a physical impact as well, because that means that there's a road going in there and that there's campsites around. And that creates compaction, and that creates lack of connectivity. And what's even worse about that is that, you get people there, like one of our wetlands that we're monitoring called Blue Bluffs. People go there and they camp there, and they leave. They don't, there's no bathrooms there, so they just utilize the bathroom of the outdoors right next to the wetland. And we've got trouble with them shooting turtles because they're on the logs, and I guess they're bored or whatever, but we have problems with people impacting the wildlife just by their presence. And these are also the situations where we have non-native fish in these wetlands on public lands because people have illegally introduced them there, thinking that they could develop their own fishing recreation. So chemical impacts. So what are the chemical impacts? Well, the logging increases nutrient and sediment input, as does roads, because roads channel the water, and oftentimes that can go and end up in a wetland. And so you end up with more nutrient and sediment input, and that has a huge effect on the water chemistry of the wetland. And then in an agricultural situation where you have fertilizers and livestock, and actually with logging as well, they fertilize, at least on private land, they fertilize, and that has an impact again on that increase of nutrient and sediment input. And so there's herbicides as well as fertilizers that are aerially sprayed, at least on private lands. Not sure that I know herbicides I don't think are sprayed on public lands currently, but they're heavily sprayed on private lands. And so that actually then is captured in wetlands and causes more of these chemical impacts that affect the overall habitat conditions of those wetlands. So what are the biological impacts? Well, they're introduction of non-native species, and in particular fish like smallmouth and largemouth bass, sunfish, and bullheads, and hatchery trout too. In fact, I observed directly the dumping of hatchery rainbow trout into a wetland called Carmen Lake, and those trout were diseased. And they were, all just flopping and turning around. And that disease can transfer into the native, in particular, the amphibian species. And so there's this huge risk of that, not to mention the fact that all of these species, this gets back to evolutionary biology and how important it is. These species actually evolved, like the red-legged frog and the cascade frog, to put their eggs where there were no predators. And so that's why they went to these isolated wetlands. So if you don't have these, if you put the predators in with where they are, they didn't evolve to deal with that. Obviously, they're going to have problems. And that's what I've seen. I've seen huge declines in populations of red-legged frogs and in the northwestern salamander, which the northwestern salamander is a little bit more resilient to fish, but they too, their populations have declined. And so these are the species that I'm aware of. There could be more out there. These are the ones that I've generally encountered in the wetlands and in the high mountain lakes in the wilderness of the Umpqua Forest. And then, as I mentioned before, there's crayfish as well that are impacting. I personally have not observed that because we haven't surveyed directly for them, but I do know that that is a problem. And there's a problem I know at Crater Lake. And in particular with they have a unique crayfish at Crater Lake, And apparently there's been some problem there with an introduction. And mollusks are another non-native risk. In fact, it's really critical that people are careful with their equipment and their chest waders, because you can transfer non-native aquatic snails. Some are really, really tiny, and mussels. These can have, they can just dominate a system, especially if the system is already impacted by other non-native species. That's this whole thing. It's a cumulative effects scenario. And then, I don't know if you're aware of this, but this is a new one to me. Recent studies are showing, and you're probably not aware, that a lot of the earthworms you encounter around in the valley bottom everywhere are not native. And they are also finding their way into our forests. And forest soil biota did not evolve with earthworms. And so they're finding in recent studies that these non-native earthworms that we all think are great and wonderful, and we are happy that they're in our garden, are actually having a significant impact on the forest soil. So what we're focusing on in our efforts currently in wetland work, the UNLSH, is removal of invasive fish and bullfrogs in these lower to mid elevation wetlands. We're currently working on the Tiller Ranger District and on a private land wetland, as I mentioned earlier, the Applegate wetland. And these are the two groups that we're focusing on, is the invasive fish and bullfrogs. So what invasive fish? We've got in these particular areas, we've done trapping, and I'll get into that a little bit later to find out, well, what fish are there? And it's bullheads, black bullheads, and there could be other bullheads that are introduced, but that's what we have that we found. We found bass, smallmouth bass mainly, and a sunfish, and that's various different kinds of sunfish, and bullfrogs. And so we're also focusing on, from the physical standpoint, of securing the wetland from head cutting and water loss. So we've done that with one of the wetlands. The first wetland we worked on starting in 2016 is Drew Wetland. And that head cutting has been treated. And we've also done some treatments to reduce the fish populations. We haven't successfully eliminated them, but we've had a major impact such that we've actually seen a very nice increase in population of red-legged frogs. And so we're still working on that. It's a question of which technique to use, and I'll get into that in a minute. And so the other thing we're doing at the Applegate is we're actually doing a similar thing that we did at Drew. We're using the technique of draining, and that will be effective at the Applegate. We have some challenges at Drew that we have to address to decide which way to go there, but I'll get into that later. So the monitoring protocols then that we're using will determine the species response and the efficacy of the effort. And so it's key to know that if you do any of the kind of work that I'm talking about, you have to have ODF and W and Army Corps permits. And you know, if you're doing any alteration of the wetland structure itself, like draining or anything, that's an Army Corps permit requirement. And then you have to get ODF and W permits to do any handling of wildlife before you do anything. Now, if you're just out there looking, it's one thing, but if you're out there doing any kind of handling, then you need to work with ODF and W regardless. And then a very important element here is sanitation of your equipment and chest waders. I say this because it's so easy to not do that properly. And so I'm reminding that this is necessary and that you use either chlorine or this Virkon dip. And it's not just to get rid of any potential non-native mollusks, for example. There are actually some fungus that are spreading all over the world that are deadly to amphibians, like the chytrid fungus. So there are things that you could transfer And you don't want to do that. And so you have to make sure you don't just clean the chest waders by dipping them in chlorine or this Virkon S. You also need to make sure you look at those boot bottoms and you clean out, because a lot of the boot bottoms have, you know, little nooks and crannies and holes that you have to clean out that debris. So we are using the techniques of draining the wetland to remove the bullfrogs and fish. And you can, and the reason that works for bullfrogs is their life history strategy. Again, their evolutionary strategy is that they require permanent water, and they require 2 years for their tadpoles to metamorphose, whereas our native species evolved with drought. This is the West, and they've had to deal with that. So they actually, their tadpoles metamorphose by mid-July, if not earlier. And so that when a pond dries up, it's not an issue. And so that's a trick to understand that then if you've got bullfrogs in a wetland, you can drain that wetland, kill the tadpoles, but you also have to address the adults. You have to eliminate the adults. And there are other, you know, there are strategies for that. I'm not going to get into deep details on that, but basically it's you can capture the young ones that maybe have changed into adults and treat them with Oragel, or you capture the adults and treat them with Oragel, which makes them pass on, or you use a pellet or shotgun. Those are the two most effective methods that I have found, and you always have to use non-lead with that. Of course, you're not going to be doing that with students, I would expect, but that's something that we do. And we also remove the remaining invasives by netting. So once you drain, and this is a tough strategy in wetlands because there's always a little pool of water left, and this is what we're finding. Well, it's a small pool of water, and you know that the fish are all concentrated there. So you just have to get in there and net it. It sounds really easy, but the reality is it's very muddy to get to that spot. And oftentimes with the timing you have, you can't just walk to it. And so there are strategies we're now going to be employing to get us access to those spots so that we can net more appropriately. The other strategy is called rotenone, and rotenone is a natural chemical from a plant from, I believe, South America, and it will eliminate all gilled species. Now, there have been times where that has been used where I don't support it, like in Diamond Lake, which is a huge lake, and all it does when you have fishing recreation in the first place, it's kind of moot to try to rotenone something that people will then come back in and impact again. So it's been done twice, and it's been cost millions of dollars, and it hasn't really addressed the issue. It, in that case, is a good example of a symptomatic versus a systematic use of a tool. And so again, that's an important thing to look at. When you're going in and you're doing these wetlands, are you doing something that's symptomatic, or are you doing something that's systematic? By draining the wetland, we are actually kind of mimicking the drought cycle, and it will help us to systematically eliminate the species that are not supposed to be there. It's one of the reasons why I like the draining approach, but it does take some special stuff to do that. Here's an example of Drew Lake, and this is after it was drained, and it may seem like you can walk out to that little pool of water out there, and this is Drew Wetland. It's often referred to as Drew Lake, but it's really a wetland. But that little pool of water, you can't get to that. It's like quicksand if you try to get to that. And that little, I did not put that there, but that wooden pallet was somebody's attempt at to try to access, and that's I think since been removed, or it's still there, but it will eventually be removed. But it's kind of a good gives you kind of a scale there to look at that wetland. And notice that up above that wetland, that whole area was logged, and those are pretty young trees growing up there. But on the other side of the wetland that you can't see, there is a nice forest buffer. Not probably big enough, but it certainly has been effective and to some extent in providing habitat for this particular wetland, the red-legged frog. It's pretty high elevation actually for the red-legged frog, but this wetland should have thousands of egg masses in it. It's big. And when I monitored that in years past, it had no more than 4 or 5 egg masses annually. And after we drained this and we did a bunch of trapping, this had bullhead in it. Bullhead fish, which I had no idea was impacting as smallmouth bass. It turns out bullhead fish are voracious, and they spend a lot of their time in the shallow emergent vegetation where the eggs and the tadpoles of the native species are, eating them. And I wouldn't know that had I not spent so much time out there, and 3 days of survey is not enough. You got to be out there really looking in that case to see how they behaved in that wetland. But since we drained it and we kept trapping and trapping and trapping, we went from 0 to 4 egg masses after 2 years, because it takes 2 years for any young red-leggeds to survive and to adulthood to become sexually mature. Then after that 2 years, we started counting. We now had 62, 63 egg masses. So we actually had successful reproduction.
Cindy, just so you know, you're a little under half an hour left.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this wetland, the Drew Lake wetland, didn't have the dredging like the other wetlands that we're dealing with had. And so in that case, I'm going to refer to 2 other wetlands that we're just starting to work on. And one is our focus area shadow wetland. The other one is Blue Bluffs. Both of them have been modified in terms of their water level. Shadow has been dammed with a small earthen dam to increase the water level. Blue Bluffs has been dredged. And the dredging, we're going to save Blue Bluffs for not this year, but future years. It's going to be one of the hardest ones to deal with, but it's a good example of a place that lost its natural shelving from the dredging that was done. And they dredged it because they thought they'd create a recreational trout fishery. Well, that didn't work. The wetland did not support the trout. And now we have a mess out there. This is on the forest land, on the national forest land. And the species that were there are not doing well. We've only managed to document 1 or 2 red-legged egg masses over many, many years. And then other people came in and introduced, in this case, we have what are called pumpkin seed sunfish. And those pumpkin seed sunfish are completely modifying this habitat along with all the structural loss. This place is eutrophying like nothing I've ever seen. I'm going to show you a picture here on this forest. I mean, I feel like I'm down in Louisiana or something. So anyway, then what we need to do there is to take that dredged soil and put it back into the wetland and redo that shelving. We're going to be doing that at the Applegate wetland, same issue there. And so there's an interesting place to actually see that happening in current time. We'll be working on that this summer. And so then what are you going to do? You can either allow the sedges that are there and the willows that are there and the other riparian aquatic emergent vegetation to reestablish itself, or you can help that along by replanting. Now, by doing that, you want to make sure that you choose local sources, and I mean sources that are right there. It's really scary when we start moving things from, like buying them from greenhouses that grow native plants, because again, you don't know what's in that potted soil you're dealing with. And so it's best to try to get your stuff on site or near site. So here is an example of what we're going to be working on this summer. This is the Applegate wetland, and we're going to, that area there was dredged out, and actually they pulled it from, anyway, they dredged it all out, and it's really quite deep and steep, and there's not much in the way of riparian and emergent vegetation, as you can see there anyway. And so we're going to be modifying that and creating shelving from the dredging. And here's an example of Blue Bluffs, and I don't know if you can see, but that water is really, really thick. You can't see through it. In fact, what we're trying to do there is a mollusk survey. And because of the eutrophication and all the algae in the water, you can't see anything. The turbidity is so bad. And I was out there this past couple months, and even in the wintertime, the algae blooms are crazy. And this is just an example of the tool that you would use. This is from Tom Biebighauser's effort on doing he was actually creating a wetland here in a place that we had an opportunity. But that particular piece of equipment is how you actually work on these wetlands to restore those shelving, and also remember that head cutting issue. And this is a really fun, again, physical science stuff we talk about here, how you measure to create that vertical, it's called a vertical grade structure that you establish at the outlet of the wetland at the stream head, at the head of the stream of the outlet. And a vertical straight grade structure is what's dealing with this. This is two examples of head cutting, moving upstream and literally unraveling those stream conditions. And when you do that, you lose so much water, not just within the stream bed itself, but there's a whole bunch of water that's stored adjacent to that stream out from the stream. And here's what a vertical grade control structure looks like from an engineering standpoint. So you can see there's some engineering science and physical science to be learned here. And so we focus on species sensitive to impacts. We'll cover 2 survey protocols for pond breeding amphibians very quickly here because I'm running out of time. But I really gave you a lot of the best information. So if you want to do the survey protocols, come out with me. And join us in our efforts. I'm looking for volunteers. We'll also do some Western pond turtle survey work as well. And timing is critical for this. And you have to be there when they're laying their eggs. And you also need to survey for those non-native species, and that involves trapping, snorkeling, netting, electrofishing, and visual observation. You have to do a protocol of 3 visits and then sometimes 4 to these wetlands just to conduct these pond breeding surveys. And there's different egg deposition timing with elevation and temperature of the water and the air. So you have to kind of time all that with the right elevation. You got to know your timing then for that location. And for safety, you always go with at least 1 person. And here's your basic equipment: nets, chest waders, sticks to dig in the water to see if you're going to get yourself too deep in mud. You have to kind of feel your way through this. And then water and air thermometers, a scale for measuring water depth, because the egg masses, like for red-legged frogs, are laid in a certain depth in the water, and it's always good to measure that. You have counters for counting how many eggs, because it's so hard to keep track of that if you got a lot. And then you want some GPS equipment to monitor and to document where those egg mass sites are, and some survey forms to fill out that data. Here's an example of an impacted wetland. It has a little buffer around it, but look at what that connectivity looks like between it and the forest near it. These are some of the trapping tools we use. We'll use these to trap fish. If we're trying to figure out what fish are present, we might use these on the one that's kind of square there for Western pond turtle too, but there's very specific protocols for that. And you can't trap fish where there are Western pond turtles without taking special measures as well, because you can literally drown the Western pond turtle in those, because they'll try to get in there. This is one of the species we found at Blue Bluffs. This is the pumpkin seed fish that's causing trouble there that somebody introduced illegally. We had tons of that. Here's another kind of net that is used. I think you can see in the lower left, there's actually a pond turtle in that net. This is one of the ways that we detect Western pond turtles in wetlands. One of the best ways, besides visual surveys, is to trap them in these traps. Here is an important reference for you. This is the tool that you use. These are where the protocols are. There's actually a sampling amphibians for Atlantic habitats, and there's also one for lotic habitats, your flowing waters. And the Society of Northwestern Vertebrate Biology did an excellent job of putting these protocols together. Here's a survey form. Here's 2 books you want to have too. These are amphibian identification field guide. And here's Thomas Biebighauser, and I've had a wetland restoration workshop with him in the past. I may do that again in the next couple of years in partnership with Umpqua Watershed. So be aware that is he's coming back to do some restoration in the next couple of years on the Tiller Ranger District. So it'll be a great opportunity for you and your students to get involved. And here's how you basically do a survey. These lines are two people that are walking through a wetland. They're going out to about 1 meter in depth where there's emergent vegetation, and that's their main place where you look. But if you got something in the middle that's emergent vegetation, you want to try to get there. But if you can't get there because it's too deep, then you can't get there. So you survey as much as you can survey, and that you do the same thing year after year after year, you can still get your population trends. Here's an example of Drew Lake, and this is all sedges, and this is actually probably inundated with water right now, but it dries up later into the year. But this demonstrates that that's a very good habitat for amphibians, because that's what you want, lots of those sedges growing. And here's another example of how to survey the habitat. And note that, you spend most of your time focusing for egg masses in the vegetation, but depends on what kind of survey you're doing. If you're doing a survey for macroinvertebrates, you would divide this up and do by habitat. You need to look at what kind of habitat you're surveying. So you got to clean your equipment, don't forget. And I think I'm almost on time here. Umpqua Natural Leadership Science Hub is currently conducting projects all summer this summer, and we start, we're continuing to do that. I'm going out this Sunday. We'll be surveying Drew Wetland this Sunday, and we'll be doing shadow as well. Doing some bullfrog work at Shadow Wetland in May. And then Applegate will start it back up in May, draining and removal of fish and bullfrogs in August. And remember, we're going to do some modification of the habitat there that will be interesting. And we're also surveying at Shadow and Blue Bluffs and Applegate in 2023 through 2020. So this guy, don't forget him. He's really important and valuable to wetland development. And we've got some real issues with our own state, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, because they classify this guy as a predator, and he has no protection on private lands, she. And we need them. We need them to maintain wetlands. They are one of the most important wetland maintainers right there. And so when we're trying to restore or recover wetlands, we need to keep the beaver in mind and try to make sure that we're doing things that help the beaver be able to use those wetlands and get connectivity to them. And how am I doing for time?
You actually still have 15 minutes.
Wow, well, that's enough time for questions and thoughts or comments. And so we are there. And let's see if I can bring my face back up here.